Men crossed jungles for it. They dragged armor through mud, pushed horses through rivers, climbed mountains where the air thinned in their lungs, and stared across plains that seemed to run forever. Somewhere ahead, they were told, lay a city of gold, not a handful of treasure, not a temple. A city. El Dorado waited just beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next green wall of trees. And because it was never found, it became even more powerful. But this is not simply the story of a lost city. It is the story of a promise, one so bright that it blinded the men who followed it, and so deadly that entire expeditions disappeared into landscapes they barely understood. To understand El Dorado, we have to begin with the hunger that surrounded it. Gold was never just metal. In the 16th century imagination, it meant salvation, rank, proof of divine favor, and a second life for men who had failed in the first one. The Americas had already given Europe enough real wealth to make fantasy feel reasonable. That was the dangerous part. The dream did not rise from nothing. It grew from fragments of truth. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we follow a city that moved every time men approached it, a rumor that began beside sacred water, a myth built from gold, conquest, misunderstanding, and obsession. El Dorado was never found, but the search for it changed the map and left its mark on the living world. Chapter 2. A rumor born beside a sacred lake. Long before El Dorado became a city on European maps, it was something smaller, stranger, and more sacred. Not a place, a person, or more precisely, a moment. Or more, high in the mountains of what is now Colombia, the Muisca people lived across a cool plateau of lakes, valleys, and cultivated fields. Their world was not the empty wilderness imagined by many Europeans who arrived there. It was organized, populated, and deeply alive with ceremony. Gold existed there, but not in the way the invaders understood it. To the Muisca, gold was not merely wealth to be counted, melted, and shipped away. It was connected to power, offering, light, and the relationship between human beings and the unseen world. Near the center of the legend stood Lake Guatavita. It is easy to picture the lake as Europeans later wanted it to be. A hidden vault, a natural treasure chest, a round blue secret waiting to be opened by determined men with shovels and schemes. But to begin, there is already to misunderstand it. For the Muisca, the lake was not valuable because it might conceal treasure. It was sacred because it belonged to a spiritual landscape. Its meaning did not begin with gold at the bottom. It began with what happened on the surface. According to accounts recorded after contact, a new ruler would take part in a ceremony on the lake. His body was covered with gold dust, transforming him into a shining figure. Then, on a raft, he would move across the water, accompanied by offerings. Gold objects and emeralds were cast into the lake, not as lost property, not as hidden wealth, but as gifts. The image is powerful even now. A man glittering in the mountain light, drifting over dark water, while metal flashed briefly and vanished below. But here is where the story begins to change. A ceremony does not travel intact when it passes through fear, translation, ambition, and interrogation. What one culture treats as an offering, another may interpret as waste. What one society sees as sacred transformation, another may reduce to evidence of unimaginable riches. And once Europeans heard that a ruler had been covered in gold, the detail did not remain a detail for long. The gilded ruler became El Dorado, the golden one. At first, that phrase referred not to a city, but to a man. This is one of the most important turns in the entire story, because it shows how myths are often born from something real. El Dorado was not invented from thin air by bored sailors or drunken soldiers. There appears to have been a ritual. There were gold offerings. There was a sacred lake. The problem was not that Europeans heard nothing true. The problem was that they heard enough truth to build a fantasy around it. And fantasy, when mixed with conquest, rarely stays small. Imagine the first retellings. A soldier hears that a ruler bathes in gold. Another hears that gold is thrown into a lake. A third is told that the people of the highlands possess fine gold work. Each account passes through men who are exhausted, suspicious, and hungry for reward. Each version becomes slightly larger, slightly cleaner, slightly more useful. A gold-covered ruler becomes a king of gold. A sacred lake becomes a lake full of treasure. A people with gold objects becomes a kingdom overflowing with wealth. And then, almost inevitably, the golden man becomes a golden city. This transformation tells us as much about the Europeans as it does about the Muisca. The Spanish were not simply collecting information. They were searching for confirmation of a desire they already carried. They wanted the world to contain another great prize. They wanted rumor to harden into geography. So when indigenous testimony did not fit their expectations, it was bent until it did. There is a quiet violence in that process, even before the physical violence begins. A ritual is stripped of its meaning. A sacred landscape is turned into a target. A living culture becomes a clue in someone else's treasure hunt. And yet, the legend remained persuasive precisely because it had roots. Pure fantasy can be dismissed, but a fantasy with a few real objects, a few real ceremonies, a few real witnesses, that is far more dangerous. It can survive doubt. It can absorb failure. When one expedition returns empty-handed, believers can say they searched the wrong lake, questioned the wrong people, followed the wrong river. The dream adjusts. Lake Guatavita became one of the earliest anchors of El Dorado, but it could never contain the myth once Europeans had enlarged it. The lake was too specific. A real place can be measured. It can be approached. It can disappoint. A myth, if it wishes to live longer, must learn to move. So El Dorado began to drift. From a ruler to a ritual, to a lake, to a kingdom, to a city somewhere beyond the known edge of the map. What began beside sacred water would soon pull men across mountains and through forests, because the story had acquired the most dangerous shape a rumor can take. It was no longer just something people remembered. It was somewhere men believed they could reach. Chapter 3. The world that made the myth possible. El Dorado did not become believable because Europeans were naive. It became believable because, for a brief and violent moment, the impossible had already happened. By the time the rumor of the Golden Ruler began to travel, Spain had seen 2 American empires fall with a speed that seemed almost unreal. The Aztec world had been broken. The Inca realm had been seized. Gold and silver, worked by skilled hands into objects of beauty and ritual meaning, had been stripped, weighed, melted, divided, and sent across the sea. For men in Europe, these were not distant myths. They were cargo. They were accounts. They were royal shares and private fortunes. They were proof that across the ocean, stories that sounded absurd could turn out to be profitable. That is the atmosphere in which El Dorado breathed. The conquest of the Americas was not just a military event. It was also a crisis of imagination. Europeans were forced to accept that whole civilizations, cities, roads, temples, markets, armies, and treasures had existed beyond their maps. Once that truth settled in, it loosened the boundary between fact and possibility. If Tenochtitlan could stand on a lake, if the Inca could command wealth across mountains, then why not another kingdom farther inland? Why not one still untouched? Why not one richer than all the rest? This is where the myth found its perfect soil. The Spanish conquest created men who had seen enough to believe in excess. Not comfortable men usually. Not patient scholars waiting for evidence. Many were soldiers, debtors, minor nobles, adventurers. Men who had crossed the Atlantic because the older world had offered them too little. In the Americas, they learned a brutal lesson. Violence, luck, and royal permission could overturn a person's life. A man who had been obscure in Spain might become a governor. A man who had owned almost nothing might command labor, land, or treasure. And yet the rewards were never evenly shared. For every conquistador who returned wealthy, many others received wounds, promises, or nothing at all. They had come too late, served the wrong commander, backed the wrong expedition, or watched the finest spoils pass into other hands. The fall of great empires did not end hunger for conquest. It sharpened it. Once the largest prizes were taken, the men who missed them began looking toward the blank spaces. Blank spaces are dangerous on a map. They invite fantasies to settle there. To European eyes, the interior of South America was still filled with uncertainty. Mountains cut across the continent like walls. Rivers seemed to lead into endless green distance. Plains opened so widely that travelers could imagine anything beyond them. Indigenous communities knew these landscapes through their own roots, alliances, stories, and boundaries. But European newcomers often understood them only in fragments, a phrase heard through an interpreter, a gesture toward the east, a mention of gold obtained through trade, a story told under pressure. From such fragments, entire kingdoms could be assembled in the mind. This does not mean every Spaniard believed every tale without question. Some were skeptical. Some understood that rumors changed as they passed from mouth to mouth. Some recognized that gold could move through trade networks, meaning that the place where it was found was not necessarily the place where it was made, mined, or offered. But skepticism had to compete with a powerful fact. The Americas had already rewarded belief. That was the trap. The early 16th century taught Europeans that greed could call itself courage, that invasion could call itself discovery, and that rumor could become policy if enough important people stood to gain from it. El Dorado fitted this world almost too well. It offered a new prize after the old prizes. It gave restless men a direction. It gave officials a reason to authorize expeditions. It gave investors a story that might turn risk into wealth. It gave chroniclers a marvel to record. And it gave disappointment a place to go. When the Golden City was not found in one valley, it might be beyond the next. When one indigenous guide denied its existence, another might be forced or persuaded to suggest a different route. When a river led nowhere useful, it could still be described as a path toward something not yet reached. The myth was not weakened by distance. For a long time, distance protected it. There is something deeply human in that, and deeply unsettling. People often imagine El Dorado as a tale of foolish men chasing a glittering fairy story, but that makes the legend too easy to dismiss. The more uncomfortable truth is that El Dorado grew out of a world where fantasy had been trained by fact. Europeans had found real gold. They had encountered real civilizations. They had watched real empires collapse. Their mistake was not believing that wealth existed in the Americas. Their mistake was believing that every story of wealth pointed toward something waiting to be taken. That belief changed everything it touched. A sacred offering became evidence. A trade object became a clue. A stranger's homeland became a route. A continent became a question asked in the language of possession. By the time El Dorado began spreading through camps, courts, and ports, it was no longer just a rumor from the Colombian highlands. It had become a mirror held up to the age of conquest. In it, men saw not what was there, but what they most wanted history to permit. Somewhere beyond the known roads, they believed, another golden world was waiting. And the most dangerous thing about that belief was that it sounded to them like experience. Chapter 4: Gold, God, and Empire. The men who followed El Dorado rarely described themselves as villains. That matters. In their own minds, many were servants of a crown, defenders of a faith, bringers of order, seekers of fortune in a world where fortune was not handed out gently. Some were ambitious. Some were desperate. Some were violent before they ever crossed the ocean. Some became more violent because the world they entered rewarded it. To understand the legend, we have to look at the machinery inside the men who chased it. Not to excuse them, but to see why the promise worked so well. Gold was the simplest motive, and also the least complete. It is easy to say they wanted wealth. They did. Gold could pay debts, buy land, secure marriage, lift a family name, purchase influence, and transform a man from a forgotten son into someone who mattered. In a society obsessed with rank, gold was not only money, it was a ladder. For many conquistadors, the New World seemed to offer what Europe had denied them: a way to rise quickly, violently, and perhaps permanently. But gold alone does not explain the endurance of El Dorado. A man can want money and still turn back when the food runs out, when fever enters the camp, when horses die, when guides vanish, when the river becomes a brown road to nowhere. The search required something more stubborn than greed. It needed a story that could make suffering feel meaningful. Empire provided that story. The Spanish crown did not simply unleash private fantasies into the Americas and look away. Conquest was tied to licenses, offices, taxes, claims, and rivalries. A successful expedition could produce not only treasure, but governorships, titles, grants of labor, and royal recognition. To find a golden kingdom was not merely to become rich. It was to become useful to empire. A man who discovered, conquered, or claimed new lands might return as someone the king could not ignore. For men born too low, too late, or too far from power, that possibility was intoxicating. Then there was religion, which moved through the conquest in ways both sincere and convenient. Many Europeans believed they were expanding Christianity into lands they understood poorly. Missionary language traveled beside chains, swords, and demands for tribute. The contradiction is not incidental, it is central. El Dorado belonged to an age when a man could speak of souls while calculating spoils, when prayer and plunder could sit in the same expedition, without seeming, to him, impossible. That is not because people in the past were incapable of seeing hypocrisy. Some did see it. Some condemned abuses. Some argued over the treatment of indigenous peoples with a moral intensity that still matters. But on the ground, far from courtrooms and theological debates, the search for wealth often swallowed restraint. The Golden Promise had a way of making every obstacle look temporary and every cruelty look useful. Debt also drove men forward, not just financial debt, though that was common enough. There was debt of reputation, debt of expectation, debt to patrons who had funded ships, weapons, horses, and supplies. An expedition was an investment, and failure was not simply disappointing. It could ruin careers. Men who entered the interior chasing El Dorado were often trapped between the dangers ahead and the disgrace behind them. Turning back meant admitting that the rumor had beaten them. So they pressed on. This is one reason the legend became so deadly. El Dorado did not need to be clearly defined. In fact, vagueness made it stronger. A known city could be reached or disproven. A moving rumor could always survive. Each uncertain report gave exhausted men permission to continue. Each piece of gold found along the way became evidence that greater wealth lay somewhere beyond reach. Even absence could be explained away. The city was hidden. The guides were lying. The route had been misunderstood. Another river, another mountain, another month. Obsession often disguises itself as logic from the inside, and El Dorado was perfectly designed for that disguise. It offered worldly reward to the greedy, spiritual language to the devout, imperial purpose to officials, adventure to the restless, and redemption to men whose earlier lives had disappointed them. Few myths have served so many hungers at once. That is why it could move from campfire to court, from soldier's boast to official expedition, from indigenous testimony to European map. It was flexible enough for everyone to use. Yet beneath all these motives lay one assumption so deep that many conquistadors barely questioned it. If such wealth existed, they had the right to take it. This is where the legend becomes more than a story of exploration. It becomes a story of possession. El Dorado turned landscapes into prizes before they were understood. It turned communities into obstacles or informants. It turned sacred objects into bullion waiting for extraction. The search was not simply about finding gold. It was about translating an entire world into the categories of European desire. And the tragedy is that the myth did contain flashes of reality. There were gold objects. There were skilled metalworkers. There were trade routes, ceremonial offerings, wealthy communities, and political systems Europeans struggled to comprehend. The Americas were not empty. They were not lacking history. They were full of meanings the invaders often failed to read because they arrived asking only one question: where is the treasure? A question that narrow can destroy a great deal. By the time El Dorado became a serious obsession, it had gathered all the forces of its century around it. Greed sharpened it. Religion sanctified it. Empire organized it. Desperation kept it alive, and fantasy made it bearable. The result was not a single expedition, but a pattern. Men entering unknown lands convinced that suffering proved they were nearing something important. They were not just chasing gold, they were chasing the version of themselves that gold seemed to promise. And that may be the most dangerous treasure of all. Chapter 5. The First Men into the Green Darkness. The first searches for El Dorado were not clean lines drawn across a map. They were movements into uncertainty. A party might begin with confidence. Men armed with swords, crossbows, harquebuses, horses, dogs, interpreters, servants, enslaved people, and indigenous carriers forced or pressured into service. There would be claims of purpose, perhaps a banner, perhaps prayers, perhaps the careful language of royal authority. But after a few weeks in the interior, the performance of order began to loosen. The land had its own command. The northern Andes and the regions around them did not behave like the landscapes many Europeans knew. Mountain roots rose sharply into cold air, then dropped toward humid valleys where insects gathered and fever waited. Rivers swelled without asking permission. Forests closed around men in armor that had been designed for a different kind of war. Horses, so terrifying in open ground, became fragile burdens on steep paths and in mud. Food supplies spoiled. Gunpowder could dampen. Boots rotted. Skin split. The body became a record of the journey. For the men who entered this world in search of golden rumors, geography was not background. It was an opponent. And it was an opponent they often misunderstood. European expeditions tended to move as if persistence could solve everything. If a river blocked the way, they would cross it. If a mountain stood ahead, they would climb. If a settlement did not yield the information they wanted, pressure could be applied. But the interior was not a puzzle built for them. It was a living network of peoples, climates, trails, seasons, and political relationships. To survive, there required knowledge they rarely possessed and often failed to respect. This is one of the quiet ironies of the El Dorado story. The men searching for hidden knowledge depended constantly on the very people they distrusted. Indigenous guides, translators, porters, and informants shaped the routes. They knew where rivers bent, where food might be found, which communities were enemies, which paths were dangerous, which stories should be treated with caution. Yet European commanders often heard this knowledge through layers of fear. A guide might speak carefully to avoid punishment. A prisoner might say what captors wanted to hear. A rival community might direct Spaniards toward an enemy. A misunderstood gesture could become a march of weeks, and always the rumor changed. In the early searches, there was rarely a single clear destination. There were reports of gold somewhere inland, of rich peoples beyond a ridge, of ornaments traded from far away, of a ruler, a lake, a valley, a house, a province. These fragments did not arrive neatly labeled. They had to be interpreted, and interpretation was where desire entered. A small gold ornament found in one village might be treated as evidence that a larger source lay beyond it. But gold travels. Objects move through trade, marriage, diplomacy, theft, inheritance, and ritual exchange. The place where a European soldier found a golden object was not necessarily the place where it had been made, mined, or originally used. This simple fact could have restrained the fantasy. Instead, it often fed it. Every object became a signpost. Every signpost pointed farther away. The landscape helped maintain the illusion. In dense forest, distance is difficult to judge. A day's march can feel like a conquest and end with the camp barely advanced. In mountains, the horizon reveals itself in layers. One ridge gives way to another, then another, as though the world is withholding its final answer. On open plains, the opposite problem appears. The eye travels farther than the body ever can. A blue line in the distance becomes a promise, then a disappointment, then another blue line beyond it. For men already prepared to believe, the land seemed to speak in hints. But the cost was paid in bodies. Disease struck without drama. Fever could reduce a fighting force faster than battle. Hunger made men desperate, and desperation made them cruel. Expeditions consumed the food of communities they passed through, often by force. When supplies failed, discipline weakened. Men who had imagined themselves as conquerors found themselves bargaining for maize, digging for roots, slaughtering animals, or stumbling forward on rations too small to sustain them. The dream of gold did not feed anyone. It is worth pausing on that, because legends often polish suffering into adventure after the fact. Later accounts can make these journeys sound like grand tests of courage, as if hardship itself proved the nobility of the search. But much of what happened was not noble. It was confusion armed with steel. It was ambition moving through lands where other people already lived. It was the refusal to turn uncertainty into humility. Still, the myth survived these failures because failure could be explained. If a party found no city, perhaps they had taken the wrong path. If the people they questioned denied knowledge of it, perhaps they were hiding the truth. If the terrain defeated them, perhaps that only proved the treasure was well protected by distance. El Dorado became a story that could not easily be disproven, because every disappointment could be folded back into belief. That is the cruel genius of a moving myth. It does not stand still long enough to be tested. The first men into the green darkness were not yet chasing the fully developed city that later maps would name and decorate. They were following unstable reports through real landscapes, searching for the source of objects and stories that had already passed through many hands. But each expedition added something to the legend. A route, a rumor, a death, a survivor's account, a new direction in which hope could be sent. And with each return, whether triumphant or broken, the story did not shrink. It spread. The interior of South America became, in European imagination, less a place than a challenge. Somewhere in its mountains, plains, and river systems, men insisted there had to be an answer large enough to justify what had already been suffered. That need, the need for the prize to equal the pain, may explain why El Dorado continued to pull people onward long after caution should have prevailed. Because once enough lives had been spent chasing a dream, admitting the dream was false became its own kind of terror. Chapter 6. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada and the Kingdom of the Muisca. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada did not set out as a man entering a legend. He set out as a commander with a difficult route, a hungry force, and the kind of ambition that could survive almost anything except success belonging to someone else. In 1536, Quesada led an expedition inland from the Caribbean coast of what is now Colombia. The journey was punishing even by the standards of the conquest. His men moved through heat, swamps, rivers, forests, hunger, disease, and exhaustion, following the Magdalena River system and the uncertain pull of reports from the interior. The expedition that climbed toward the highlands was not the same force that had begun the march. By the time they reached the plateau of the Muisca, many had died. The survivors had been stripped down by the land itself. And then the world changed. After months of hardship, the Spaniards entered a region unlike the wilderness they may have expected. The Muisca highlands were settled, cultivated, politically organized, and economically complex. There were fields, towns, markets, roads of communication, salt production, textiles, and gold work. This was not a stray village hiding a few ornaments. It was a society with its own structures of power and ritual life. To men trained by conquest to read wealth as invitation, the discovery was electrifying. Here, at last, was proof that the rumors had not been empty. Not proof of a golden city exactly, not proof of endless treasure waiting just beyond the next ridge, but enough proof to make restraint difficult. Gold objects existed. Skilled metalwork existed. Powerful rulers existed. Sacred places and offerings existed. The Muisca did not fit the crude European fantasy of a land waiting silently to be claimed. Yet, to the invaders, their very complexity made the fantasy stronger. This is one of the turning points in the story of El Dorado. The Spanish did not find the city they imagined. They found something more dangerous to the imagination. A real civilization rich enough to keep the dream alive, but not rich enough to satisfy it. Quesada and his men encountered a world where gold had meaning beyond accumulation. Among the Muisca, gold objects could be part of ceremony, status, diplomacy, and sacred exchange. The metal's value was not identical to the Spanish hunger for bullion. But conquest has a brutal talent for flattening differences. A votive object becomes treasure. A ritual offering becomes a clue. A ruler becomes a target. The sacred and the political are melted down into a question. How much is there, and where is the rest? The answer, of course, was never enough. Spanish expectations had already been shaped by Mexico and Peru. Stories of great empires and immense wealth had traveled ahead of Quesada's expedition like sparks in dry grass. So when the Muisca highlands yielded gold, it did not close the mystery. It opened it wider. If such wealth could be found here, perhaps the source lay farther away. If this society possessed gold, perhaps a greater one supplied it. If one ritual involved offerings to a lake, perhaps other lakes, other rulers, other hidden provinces were weighted beyond the edge of knowledge. A discovery that should have made the story more precise instead made it more unstable. Quesada's arrival also exposed the strange weakness of European information gathering. The Spanish wanted certainty, but their methods produced distortion. They questioned people under threat. They relied on interpreters crossing linguistic and cultural divides. They assumed that indigenous political rivalries could be read simply as honesty or deceit. They often heard directions without context, names without geography, and stories without the ritual meanings that gave them sense. And when the answers failed to fit the European desire corrected them. The Muisca became, in Spanish imagination, not only a people to conquer, but a sign pointing somewhere else. Their gold did not remain their own. It became evidence in a larger case that Europeans were building against the unknown interior. This is why El Dorado survived contact with reality. Reality did not disprove it. Reality was mined for fragments that could be rearranged into myth. There was also a political logic at work. A commander who endured a disastrous inland expedition needed results. Survivors needed reward. Investors and officials expected justification. The discovery of Muisca wealth helped provide that justification, but it also created pressure to continue imagining more. A limited success is sometimes more dangerous than failure, because it teaches people that the next success might be greater. In that sense, Quesada's expedition became part of the machinery that kept El Dorado alive. He had not found a city made of gold. No one had. But he had helped reveal a highland world where gold sacred authority, and political sophistication were undeniably present. For Europeans already prepared to believe in hidden kingdoms, that was enough. Perhaps more than enough. It gave the myth a body, not the body it claimed to have, but a body nonetheless. Objects that could be held, ornaments that could be weighed, reports that could be written, witnesses who could be interrogated, landscapes that could be named and claimed. El Dorado was still slippery, still shifting, but it no longer floated entirely in rumor. It had touched the ground, and that made it harder to kill. The tragedy is that the Muisca world itself was far more interesting than the fantasy laid over it. A careful observer might have asked how such societies organized power, how trade connected regions, how ritual shaped politics, how metalwork carried meaning. Some did notice fragments of this complexity, but the dominant gaze of conquest was impatient. It did not linger to understand. It searched for extraction. So the kingdom of the Muisca entered European memory partly through distortion, not simply as a civilization in its own right, but as the doorway to something supposedly greater. A doorway to a city no one had seen. By the time Quesada's story joined the wider circulation of conquest reports, El Dorado had gained one of its most convincing illusions. It could now point to real gold and say, "There, you see?" The dream was not baseless. It could point to the highlands and say, "If this exists, imagine what lies beyond." And men did imagine. They imagined with maps, with weapons, with royal petitions, with exhausted bodies, and with the lives of the people whose lands were being turned into evidence. The Muisca had not hidden a golden city from the world. They had carried out rituals, made objects, governed communities, and lived within meanings Europeans only partly understood. But in the furnace of conquest, their reality was reshaped into a promise. Not enough gold to end the search. Just enough to make it continue. Chapter 7. When a ritual became a map. A ritual is not a map. It does not tell you which river to follow, which ridge to cross, which village to threaten, or how many days remain before the treasure appears. A ritual belongs to a world of meaning. A map belongs to a world of measurement. El Dorado became dangerous when Europeans began forcing one into the shape of the other. The original story of the gilded ruler was already fragile by the time it entered Spanish ears. It had passed through languages, gestures, assumptions, and fear. The Muisca ceremony at Lake Guatavita may have involved a ruler covered in gold dust and offerings cast into the water. But what exactly happened? How often it happened? And how outsiders first heard of it are matters filtered through later accounts. What we can say with more confidence is that Europeans did not preserve the story as a spiritual act. They converted it into evidence. That conversion changed everything. A ceremony beside a lake became proof of a hidden source. The man covered in gold became a ruler of extraordinary wealth. The offerings became deposits waiting to be recovered. And then, through a process that feels almost inevitable in the age of conquest, the golden ruler became a location. This is one of the strangest evolutions in the history of the legend. El Dorado began as the Gilded One, a human figure within a ritual frame. But a person can die. A ceremony can cease. A lake can be reached and searched. A city, however, can remain just beyond the known world. A city gives the imagination walls, streets, palaces, rulers, armies, and treasure houses. It gives ambition something to march toward. So the myth changed shape. It moved from body to landscape. The process was rarely deliberate, in the neat way later summaries make it sound. No single man sat down and decided to turn a ritual into a city. Instead, the transformation happened through hundreds of small distortions. A commander heard that gold came from the east. A captive, hoping to survive, pointed toward another people. An interpreter found the closest Spanish word for a concept that did not fit Spanish categories. A soldier wrote home with more confidence than the evidence deserved. A chronicler, working from reports, smoothed confusion into narrative. By the time these fragments reached readers far away, uncertainty had been trimmed away. This is how false geography is born. Not always from lies, but from untidy information made too tidy. The Europeans wanted names, they wanted directions, they wanted origins. If gold was found among the Muisca, where did it come from? If a sacred lake received offerings, who supplied them? If one ruler was gilded, where was his kingdom? These were not absurd questions, but they were asked inside a violent system where the answer was expected to justify movement, conquest, and seizure. Under that pressure, indigenous testimony could become almost impossible to read clearly. Some people may have described real trade networks. Others may have spoken of neighboring groups, political rivals, distant lands, or places known only by reputation. Some may have answered in ways meant to redirect danger away from their own communities. Some may have been misunderstood. Some may have been forced to speak under conditions where truth and survival did not point in the same direction. The Spanish often treated contradiction as concealment. If one account differed from another, it did not necessarily weaken the legend. It could be taken to mean that the treasure was being protected by secrecy. If a guide failed to lead them to gold, he might be accused of deception. If a community denied knowledge of a golden city, perhaps they were afraid, or hiding it, or loyal to its ruler. This logic made the myth nearly immune to ordinary correction. Evidence supported it. Silence supported it. Failure supported it. And each failure pushed El Dorado farther away. That movement is crucial. The legend survived because it refused to stay in one place. When the Highland stories failed to produce the expected abundance, El Dorado drifted eastward. When one lake disappointed, another lake became possible. When one province offered no city, the next province inherited the dream. The myth behaved almost like a horizon. Walk toward it, and it retreats at the same pace. There is a sober lesson here about how conquest reads the world. The Spanish were not merely mistaken about geography. They were trying to translate indigenous worlds into a language of extraction. A lake was not allowed to remain sacred water. A ritual was not allowed to remain an offering. A gold object was not allowed to remain art, status, or devotion. Everything became a clue in a treasure investigation. Meaning was flattened into usefulness. And yet, the legend did not become powerful because every detail was false. That would have made it weaker. It became powerful because fragments were true enough to tempt belief. Gold was present. Ceremonies did occur. Some communities were wealthy by regional standards. Trade did connect distant places. European invaders were not hallucinating every glint of metal. They were misreading the system that gave those objects meaning. This is why El Dorado is more unsettling than a simple fairy tale. It shows how reality can be damaged by the wrong kind of attention. The conquerors looked closely, but not carefully. They listened, but often only for confirmation. They asked questions, but their questions had already narrowed the possible answers. A story that might have revealed something profound about Muisca ritual life instead became a marching order. Over time, maps and reports began to give the legend a kind of authority it had not earned. Names were written down, routes were proposed, empty spaces acquired suggestion. Once ink touched parchment, speculation looked more disciplined than it really was. A rumor spoken in a camp could be doubted. A place marked on a map seemed to demand investigation. The ritual had become geography, and geography, in European hands, could summon armies. By now, El Dorado was no longer one thing. It was a man, a rite, a lake, a province, a kingdom, a city, and a direction. Its contradictions did not destroy it, because different people needed different versions. Soldiers needed a prize. Officials needed justification. Investors needed hope. Chroniclers needed marvels. Cartographers needed names for blankness. Each version kept the others alive. This is the moment when the story becomes truly difficult to kill. A ritual can be forgotten. A rumor can fade. But a moving target can always be searched for again. And so El Dorado slipped out of the waters of Guatavita and entered the wider continent, no longer bound to the ceremony that had given it birth. What began as sacred transformation had become imperial instruction. Men would now follow not the truth of the ritual, but the shape their own desire had drawn around it. They believed they were reading a map. In truth, they were reading themselves. Chapter 8. The lake that men tried to drain. Lake Guatavita did not need to be invented. That was the trouble. Unlike the later Golden City, which wandered across maps and rumors, the lake was real. It could be reached. It could be pointed to. It sat high in the Colombian landscape, quiet and circular, holding its own history beneath the surface. And because there were stories of offerings thrown into its waters, men came to believe that the lake was not merely sacred. They believed it was hiding something from them. There is a particular kind of obsession that only attaches itself to real places. A rumor in the distance can be chased forever, but a lake presents a more practical temptation. You can stand at its edge. You can measure its banks. You can imagine the bottom. You can tell yourself that the treasure is not mythical at all, only inconveniently wet. So Guatavita became a problem to be solved, not understood. Solved. The logic was simple enough. If gold had been thrown into the lake, then gold remained there. If enough water could be removed, the sacred offerings would become recoverable objects. What had once passed from human hands into the realm of ceremony would be brought back into the world of weight, ownership, and sale. The lake became a vault, and men began thinking like thieves with engineering plans. Over time, various attempts were made to recover treasure from Guatavita. Some involved cutting into the rim of the lake to lower the water level. Others were driven by the same basic idea: reduce the lake, expose the bottom, take what lay there. The work was dangerous and difficult, and the rewards never matched the scale of the fantasy. Some gold was reportedly recovered from the lake or its margins over the centuries, enough to confirm that offerings had indeed been made, but never enough to satisfy the dream that had grown around the place. That difference matters. A few real objects can prove a ritual. They cannot prove a city. But to the men who wanted El Dorado, the distinction was easy to ignore. Every recovered fragment seemed to whisper that more remained below. Every failure could be blamed on technique, depth, mud, weather, lack of funds, poor timing, or the stubbornness of the lake itself. The treasure was not absent. It was merely still concealed. Guatavita became a physical version of the entire El Dorado myth. There was truth beneath the surface, but not the truth people demanded from it. The image of men trying to drain a sacred lake is almost too perfect, because it reveals the whole psychology of conquest in miniature. They did not ask first what the offerings meant. They asked how to retrieve them. They did not see the lake as part of a living ceremonial world. They saw it as an obstacle placed between themselves and value. The water was not sacred protection. It was a technical inconvenience. This is the point where greed becomes strangely literal. To misunderstand a ritual in speech is one thing. To cut into the land in order to undo that ritual is another. The act of draining Guatavita was not only a search for treasure. It was an attempt to reverse a sacred gesture. The Muisca had given objects to the lake. Europeans and later treasure seekers tried to force the lake to give them back. There is a kind of violence in that reversal, even when no battle is taking place. It is easy, from a distance, to laugh at the futility of it. Men opening channels, lowering water, sinking money and labor into a dream that refused to become profitable. But the laughter should be cautious. The lake did contain gold. The obsession was not born from pure emptiness. That is what made it durable. Reality kept offering just enough evidence to prevent surrender. This is one of the cruel patterns that appears again and again in the story of El Dorado. The myth did not survive despite evidence. It survived because evidence arrived in fragments small enough to be misused. A golden figurine, a ceremonial object, a remembered offering, a report from a guide. Each fragment was real or plausible enough to keep men moving, but too incomplete to correct their expectations. The lake taught that lesson with unusual clarity. If nothing had ever been found there, perhaps Guatavita would have lost its spell more quickly. But if treasure was found, even a little, the imagination became harder to restrain. The mind does not naturally stop at some. It leaps toward more, then toward much more, then toward hidden beyond reach. In that leap, El Dorado lived. The lake also exposed a deeper European frustration. A city could always be somewhere else, but Guatavita could not run away. Its refusal was more intimate. Men could stare directly at the place they believed held riches and still fail to possess it. The water turned desire back on itself. It forced them to confront the possibility that the world might contain sacred wealth without offering it up as reward. That possibility was difficult for conquerors to accept. The attempts to drain or cut into the lake did more than search for gold. They changed the meaning of the place in European memory. Guatavita was no longer remembered primarily as a sacred site of Muisca ritual life. It became famous as a treasure location, a riddle, a failed excavation, a symbol of what might still lie just out of reach. The old ceremony remained in the story, but now it served mostly as a prologue to extraction. Again, the original meaning was pushed aside by the appetite it provoked. And yet the lake endured, not untouched, not undamaged, not free from the consequences of obsession, but still there, refusing to become the vault imagined by those who attacked it. In a story full of moving rumors, Guatavita offers something more grounded and more haunting. It reminds us that El Dorado was not only a fantasy projected onto empty space. It was built on real places, real ceremonies, and real misunderstandings that had material consequences. Men did not merely dream of the golden city. They dug for it. They cut earth for it. They lowered water for it. They turned sacred geography into a work site. And when the lake failed to deliver treasure on the scale they wanted, they did not abandon the larger dream. They carried it elsewhere. The disappointment of Guatavita did not kill El Dorado, because the legend had already learned to detach itself from any single place. If the lake held only part of the truth, then perhaps the rest waited beyond the mountains, beyond the rivers, beyond the plains. The lake remained behind as proof and warning at once. Proof that the golden legend had roots. Warning that roots are not the same as the tree imagined above them. Guatavita's waters held offerings, but not the empire of gold Europeans desired. Its depths preserved memory, but not the answer to their hunger. In the end, the lake gave them exactly what myths often give: enough truth to begin the chase, and enough silence to make it endless. Chapter 9. The German Conquistadors and the Price of the Dream. El Dorado was not only a Spanish obsession. That is easy to forget, because the legend grew out of the Spanish conquest, and because so many of its most famous names were Spanish. But the hunger behind it was European. It moved through courts, counting houses, military camps, and merchant networks. It attracted not only soldiers with swords, but financiers with ledgers. In the early 16th century, one of the strangest chapters in the search unfolded through the ambitions of the Welser family, powerful German bankers with deep connections to imperial finance. Through arrangements with the Spanish crown, the Welsers gained rights in the province of Venezuela. On paper, this was a business venture tied to colonization, settlement, and extraction. In practice, it became another gateway into the interior, where rumor promised wealth beyond the coast. The men who entered that world under German backing were not chasing a neat legend with a fixed address. They were following reports of rich lands inland, stories that overlapped with the widening dream of El Dorado. The names shift in the records, the geography blurs, but the pattern is familiar. Europeans hearing of gold beyond the next inhabited zone, then pushing deeper into territories they did not understand, leaving devastation behind them. Ambrosius Anger was among the first of these German-linked commanders to move with force into the interior. His expeditions were harsh, hungry, and violent. Men marched through difficult country looking for wealth, food, captives, and information. Indigenous communities became targets not simply because they possessed goods, but because they were treated as obstacles between Europeans and the imagined treasure beyond. When supplies ran low, the expedition did not become more humble. It became more dangerous. That is one of the recurring truths of El Dorado. Starvation did not always weaken conquest. Sometimes it made conquest more brutal. A starving expedition is not just a suffering group of men. It is an armed body searching desperately for someone else's food. The dream of gold may have pulled them inland, but survival shaped their daily actions. Villages could be raided. People could be seized as guides or carriers. Local conflicts could be exploited or misunderstood. A rumor offered by one community might send violence toward another. In such conditions, information itself became a form of danger. Nicholas Federmann, another figure connected to the Welser enterprise, also pushed into the interior. Like others before and after him, he moved through a landscape where the promise of wealth seemed always to recede. His journeys eventually brought him into the broader world of New Granada, where Spanish ambitions were already colliding in the highlands. The search was no longer a single line of advance. It was becoming a web of overlapping claims, rival commanders, exhausted men, and indigenous societies forced to endure the consequences of European competition. The German expeditions reveal something important about the legend's power. El Dorado did not require one empire, one language, or one commander. It could attach itself to any system that believed risk could be turned into possession. A banker in Europe did not need to see a sacred lake. A soldier did not need to understand Muisca ritual. A colonial official did not need proof of a golden city. Each person in the chain needed only enough belief to justify the next investment, the next march, the next petition, the next act of violence. The myth became economically useful before it became geographically true. That is a grim kind of success. The Welser-backed ventures also remind us that conquest was not only a drama of bold men in shining armor. However often later stories tried to frame it that way, it was entangled with debt, contracts, royal grants, expected returns, and private capital. Behind many expeditions stood people who calculated profit from a distance. They did not have to sleep in flooded camps or bury men along the trail, but their expectations traveled with the expedition like invisible weight. For commanders, that weight mattered. Failure could mean more than personal disappointment. It could mean lost favor, accusations, legal trouble, financial ruin, or replacement by rivals. The farther men went, the more they needed the journey to mean something, and when gold failed to appear, they often demanded payment from the only people within reach. The people beneath the legend paid first. There is no way to tell this part of the story honestly while treating the search as romantic exploration. The expeditions connected to Ahinger, Fetterman, and the Welser enterprise were part of a larger pattern of coercion and violence in northern South America. They moved through populated lands, not empty spaces. Their maps were incomplete, but the territories were not ownerless. Their hunger for El Dorado created suffering long before any supposed golden kingdom could be found. And still, the dream survived. Part of its survival came from the structure of rumor itself. When Europeans entered a region and found no city, they did not necessarily conclude the city was imaginary. They often concluded that the information had been incomplete. If one people did not possess the treasure, perhaps they knew who did. If one direction failed, another direction could be tested. If a commander died, the rumor did not die with him. It passed into the reports of survivors, rivals, and successors. El Dorado did not need victories. It fed on attempts. The German conquistadors also show how the legend expanded beyond its original roots. The sacred Muisca ceremony at Guatavita was still one source of the myth, but by now the search had absorbed many other reports of inland wealth. El Dorado had become a language Europeans used to interpret almost any rumor of gold in the northern half of South America. It was less a specific memory than a habit of expectation. That habit was deadly. It taught men to believe that every community was concealing a greater secret. It made distance feel like evidence. It turned ignorance into momentum, and because expeditions were expensive, dangerous, and politically loaded, each one created pressure for the next. No commander wanted to be remembered as the man who turned back too soon. There is something almost modern in the way the myth operated through investment and sunk cost. Money had been spent. Men had died. Reports had been written. Claims had been made. Therefore, the Golden Land had to be real, or at least real enough to keep pursuing. Otherwise, all that suffering would become meaningless. So the expeditions continued to grind inland, not as clean, heroic quests, but as messy, violent enterprises where fantasy and finance shook hands. The Welser connection makes the El Dorado story colder in a way. It reminds us that obsession does not always look like madness. Sometimes it looks like a contract. Sometimes it wears the face of administration. Sometimes it begins with numbers in a ledger and ends with bodies on an unnamed trail. The Golden City remained out of reach, but the price of seeking it was already being paid in full. Chapter 10. Into the Llanos, where the horizon lied. The search for El Dorado kept moving east. That movement was not random. It followed rumor, frustration, geography, and the strange logic of men who believed that absence was not defeat, only misdirection. If the Golden Kingdom had not been found in the highlands, perhaps it waited beyond them. If the sacred lake had yielded only fragments, perhaps the true source lay farther into the interior. If one people possessed gold, but not enough, then surely another people, somewhere beyond trade and testimony, possessed more. So the dream entered the Llanos. The Llanos are vast plains stretching through parts of present-day Colombia and Venezuela. A world of open grasslands, seasonal floods, rivers, heat, insects, and distances that can humble the eye. After the enclosed difficulty of mountains and forests, the plains offered a different kind of deception. They did not hide the horizon. They multiplied it. A mountain can block you. A forest can swallow you. A plain can persuade you that the answer is always visible, just not yet reached. For European expeditions, that was its own form of torment. The land seemed open, but openness did not mean ease. In wet seasons, water could spread across enormous distances, turning routes into marsh and campgrounds into islands. In dry seasons, heat and thirst could punish men and animals alike. Rivers did not always behave like roads. They curved, flooded, divided, and carried travelers into places where supplies disappeared faster than hope. Yet the Llanos made El Dorado feel plausible in a new way. Across such space, a distant line of trees could become a sign of settlement. A shimmer of water could suggest a lake. A range of hills might look like the edge of another world. Indigenous accounts, whether accurately understood or badly distorted, seem to point onward, farther east, farther south, beyond this river, past those people, toward a richer land. The horizon became a collaborator in the myth. It lied without speaking. Or perhaps more accurately, men made it lie for them. The landscape did not promise a city of gold. It simply refused to end quickly. That refusal gave the imagination room to work. Every day of travel produced new distance, and distance protected belief. El Dorado survived best where knowledge thinned out. The farther Europeans moved from familiar routes, the easier it became to fill uncertainty with desire. The river systems of northern South America deepened the illusion. Rivers were practical routes, but they were also narrative devices. They seemed to lead somewhere. A river has direction, movement, authority. To step into its current is to feel that the land itself is guiding you. For men seeking a hidden kingdom, this mattered. If a river flowed from the unknown, perhaps it carried news of the unknown. If gold ornaments appeared among peoples along its banks, perhaps the river connected them to the source. Again, a reasonable observation became dangerous when sharpened by greed. Trade networks really did move objects across distance. Stories really did travel from one community to another. Rivers really did connect worlds. But a connection is not a straight line to a treasure house. The Spanish and other Europeans often mistook circulation for origin. Because gold appeared here, they imagined it must come from there. Because someone had heard of wealth inland, they imagined a kingdom waiting intact and available. The Llanos turned those assumptions into motion. Expeditions crossed and recrossed spaces where the physical difficulty was matched by informational confusion. A name might refer to a people, a region, a leader, or a direction. A story might describe a real place, a political enemy, a ceremonial center, or a memory already changed by retelling. Europeans wanted stable geography, but they were often moving through landscapes of relationship. Places understood through alliances, hostilities, seasonal movement, trade, and oral knowledge. When that complexity passed through conquest, it hardened into crude instruction. Go there. Ask them. Seize a guide. Find the gold. The tragedy is that the farther the search moved, the more destructive its uncertainty became. In a known city, violence may be concentrated. In a rumor zone, violence spreads. Every village might be hiding information. Every guide might be suspected of lying. Every refusal might be interpreted as resistance. The Golden City did not need to exist in order to endanger the people who lived along the imagined route to it. That is one of the darkest features of El Dorado. It made entire landscapes provisional. Communities were not encountered as societies with their own histories and rights. They were treated as thresholds, obstacles, clues, or temporary sources of food. The search turned the present into a corridor leading toward a fantasy, and the fantasy always stood farther ahead. There is a psychological pattern here that deserves attention. Men chasing El Dorado often behaved as if the difficulty of the journey proved the value of the destination. The harder the plains became, the more meaningful the prize had to be. A lesser treasure could not justify such hunger, sickness, fear, and death. So the imagined city grew larger in proportion to the suffering endured in its pursuit. Pain inflated the myth. This is not unique to the 16th century. Human beings still do this. We often struggle to abandon a belief after paying heavily for it. The cost becomes evidence. Sacrifice becomes commitment. To turn back is not merely to change course. It is to admit that the river, the graves, the ruined bodies, and the violence were not steps toward revelation. They were waste. For conquistadors, that admission was almost unbearable. So they read the plains as unfinished sentences. The next bend would complete them. The next informant would clarify them. The next march would convert rumor into possession. Even when the Llanos gave them nothing like the city they imagined, the sheer scale of the land suggested that somewhere beyond their failed route, the answer might still exist. The horizon did not have to be believed forever, only until the next expedition could be organized. This eastward drift also changed El Dorado's character. The older story of the gilded ruler was tied to ritual and lake water. In the Llanos, the legend became wider, less anchored, more geographic. It was no longer only about a sacred ceremony misunderstood by outsiders. It was becoming an inland empire of possibility. A golden absence stretched across river basins and open country that made it easier to attach new names, new reports, and new hopes to the legend. El Dorado could absorb contradictions because it was no longer confined to one origin. It had become a direction of desire. East, inland, beyond. Those words carried enormous power. They gave men permission to keep moving through places where their knowledge was weakest and their weapons were strongest. They allowed failure to be rebranded as partial progress. They transformed the continent into a sequence of almosts. Almost there, almost certain, almost rewarded. But the plains offered no final unveiling. Only more weather, more distance, more stories, more graves, and more reasons for believers to say the true route had not yet been found. The Llanos did not create El Dorado. They taught it how to escape. Chapter 11. The Madness of Lope de Aguirre. The search for El Dorado produced many failures. Some ended in hunger, some in disease, some in quiet retreat, with survivors carrying home only stories, scars, and excuses. But the expedition of Pedro de Ursua gave the legend something darker, a journey where the golden dream turned inward and began devouring the men who carried it. By the late 1550s, El Dorado had already changed shape many times. It had moved from the Muisca highlands into broader rumors of inland wealth, toward forests, plains, rivers, and imagined kingdoms beyond Spanish control. This made it useful to ambitious men, a failed soldier, a restless official, a desperate adventurer. All could still believe that somewhere beyond the frontier, history had left one final prize unclaimed. Pedro de Ursua was appointed to lead an expedition in search of El Dorado and the lands sometimes associated with it. The route took his force into the river world of South America, where the landscape itself seemed to dissolve ordinary authority. Rivers do that. On land, men can desert, scatter, return, or change direction. On a river, especially one running deep into the unknown, the current becomes a kind of fate. Once the boats are committed, the expedition moves as a single body, carrying its rivalries with it. And among those rivalries was Lope de Aguirre. Aguirre was not a young dreamer dazzled by the first stories of gold. He was an old campaigner by the standards of conquest, hardened by years in the Americas, bitter, wounded in reputation and body, and deeply suspicious of those above him. Later accounts often present him almost as a monster, and there is reason for that. But to leave him there, as a madman who simply appeared from nowhere, makes the story too comfortable. Aguirre was an extreme product of a violent world. He did not invent betrayal, cruelty, or ambition. He inherited them from the culture of conquest and then carried them to a terrifying conclusion. In him, the logic of El Dorado lost its polite disguise. The promises of wealth, power, royal favor, and personal redemption no longer pointed toward a hidden city. They pointed toward mutiny. As the expedition moved through hardship and uncertainty, discipline weakened. The Golden Kingdom remained distant, as always. Food, trust, and patience thinned. Men began to doubt not only the route, but the command. In such conditions, rumor changes direction. It no longer describes only treasure beyond the trees. It begins to describe betrayal within the camp. Who is favored? Who will profit? Who will be abandoned? Who has authority, and why should anyone obey him? Ursua became vulnerable not because El Dorado was near, but because it was not. A distant treasure can unite men for a while. But when the treasure does not appear, the question of who controls the expedition becomes more immediate than the dream that launched it. The men had entered the wilderness expecting a prize. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside a floating society of hunger, resentment, and armed suspicion. The rebellion that followed transformed the expedition from a search into a nightmare. Ursua was killed. Leadership shifted through conspiracy and force. Aguirre emerged as the dominant figure, not as a discoverer of El Dorado, but as the author of a new and violent purpose. The expedition's original goal began to collapse under the weight of his ambition. This is the moment when the myth reveals one of its hidden dangers. El Dorado did not merely lure men toward violence against indigenous peoples, though it certainly did that. It also destabilized the men who pursued it. It created expectations too large for reality to satisfy. When the landscape failed to deliver gold, frustration searched for human targets. Commanders became obstacles, companions became threats, loyalty became negotiable. Aguirre's rebellion eventually took on a political character that was shocking even in an age of brutal adventurers. He rejected royal authority and imagined a path of defiance against the Spanish crown itself. Whether we call that madness, treason, desperation, or the last mutation of conquistador ambition, it was a remarkable reversal. Men who had entered the Americas claiming to extend empire now turned against the empire when it no longer served their hunger. There is a bitter symmetry in that. The conquest had taught men like Aguirre that violence could remake the world. It had shown them that audacity might be rewarded, that distant authority could be defied if success followed quickly enough. That legitimacy often arrived after the fact. Aguirre simply applied those lessons without restraint. If kingdoms could be seized from indigenous rulers, why not seize power from Spanish commanders? If royal permission justified conquest, why not reject the king when permission became inconvenient? His logic was monstrous, but not entirely alien to the world that produced him. That is what makes Aguirre more than a grotesque episode in the El Dorado story. He is not an interruption of the legend. He is its mirror turned black. In earlier chapters of The Search, gold had been imagined as the thing that would redeem suffering. For Aguirre, power itself became the treasure. The city of gold receded, and in its place appeared a more immediate dream: command without accountability. The expedition left behind fear, violence, and death. Indigenous communities encountered along the route suffered from the presence of armed men who were now even less governed by restraint than before. Members of the expedition themselves were killed as suspicion hardened into purge. The search had become a moving court of paranoia, where Aguirre decided who could live inside his version of destiny. It is tempting to describe all this as the moment El Dorado turned evil. But that would be too simple. The legend had never been innocent. From the beginning, it had been bound to coercion, extraction, and misunderstanding. Aguirre did not corrupt a pure dream. He exposed the corruption already inside it. He showed what could happen when the promise of impossible wealth detached from evidence, morality, and even basic survival. In that sense, the madness was not only personal, it was structural. An expedition built on fantasy and force had entered a landscape it could not master, pursuing a prize it could not verify, under leaders whose authority depended on keeping hope alive. When hope failed, force remained, and force needed a direction. Aguirre gave it one. His story later became one of the most infamous episodes associated with the search for El Dorado, partly because it contains the drama that legends remember easily: mutiny, murder, rebellion, dissent. But beneath the drama lies a quieter warning. The Golden City did not have to exist in order to transform men. It could rearrange their loyalties, justify their cruelties, and give shape to their disappointments. It could turn an expedition into a prison and a commander into a tyrant. By the time Aguirre's rebellion burned itself into history, El Dorado had gained another layer of meaning. It was no longer only the place men failed to find. It was the thing they became while searching. Not all seekers became Aguirre. Most did not. But the myth made room for him. It offered a world where desire could outrun evidence, where violence could be dressed as destiny, and where men could mistake their own ruin for a grand design. In the end, Aguirre did not find the Golden City. He found the darkness that had been traveling with the expedition all along. Chapter 12. Manoa, the city on the lake. El Dorado survived because it learned to change its name. By the time many earlier searches had failed, the legend might have been expected to weaken. Men had crossed mountains, entered forests, followed rivers, questioned communities, drained hopes from sacred water, and still no golden city had appeared. The sensible conclusion was available. It had been available for a long time, but legends do not die simply because the evidence disappoints them. They adapt. In time, the dream began to gather around a new form, Manoa, a magnificent city said to stand near or beside a vast inland lake, often associated with Lake Parim. Here, El Dorado became less a memory of a gilded ruler and more a geography of marvel. The city was imagined somewhere in the Guyana region, beyond the better-known paths of conquest, protected not by walls alone but by distance, jungle, rivers, and uncertainty. This was not a small adjustment. It was a rescue operation. A sacred lake in the Colombian highlands had proved too limited. The Muisca world, though rich in meaning and gold work, had not yielded the empire Europeans wanted. Expeditions through the Llanos and river systems had produced suffering and stories, but no final revelation. So the myth moved into a wider blankness, where it could breathe again. Manoa gave El Dorado new architecture. Lake Parim gave it new water. Guyana gave it a new horizon. And maps, perhaps most importantly, gave it a new kind of authority. The idea of a great inland lake in northern South America was not absurd to Europeans working with fragmentary reports. Their knowledge of the continent remained incomplete, and travel accounts often mixed observation with rumor. Rivers flooded, wetlands expanded and receded. Indigenous descriptions of seasonal waters or distant regions could be misunderstood, compressed, or enlarged. In a world where geography was still being pieced together, a vast lake could feel plausible enough to print. Once printed, plausibility hardened. A lake drawn on a map has a strange power. It does not look like hearsay. It looks measured. It looks placed. The ink gives the imagination a shoreline. Around that shoreline, a city can stand. Around the city, a kingdom can grow. Around the kingdom, men can build plans. Manoa was not merely another rumor. It was El Dorado dressed in cartographic clothing. This is why the legend entered a new stage. Earlier seekers had followed testimonies, trails, and fragments of gold. Now Europeans could follow documents that appeared to organize the unknown. Maps and written accounts created a feedback loop. A traveler heard of a city near a lake. A mapmaker recorded the lake. Later readers saw the lake and became more willing to believe the traveler. Another expedition set out, collected more uncertain reports, and those reports returned to Europe as further confirmation. The myth began citing itself. That is not unusual in the history of false geography. A mistake written confidently can become the foundation for another mistake. A speculative name can be copied from one map to another until it feels inherited rather than invented. Over time, repetition begins to imitate proof. People forget where the first uncertainty entered the chain. With Manoa, El Dorado became grander, more distant, and in some ways more elegant. A city on a lake has an old power in the European imagination. It suggests isolation, wealth, reflection, secrecy. It recalls other marvels, other capitals, other stories of water protecting treasure. And unlike the earlier image of a single gilded ruler, Manoa could hold everything the myth had accumulated: palaces, temples, armies, trade, gold, and a ruler powerful enough to justify the journey. It was a fantasy built to survive disappointment. When one route into Guyana failed, believers could argue that the approach had been wrong. When no great inland lake was found where expected, perhaps it lay farther south, or appeared only seasonally, or had been concealed by poor information. The less Europeans knew, the more flexible the story became. The city remained safe because it occupied the space between report and verification. Still, we should be careful. Not every person who repeated stories of Manoa was simply lying. Some were working with incomplete knowledge. Some were repeating what they had heard from others. Some may have misunderstood indigenous descriptions of real landscapes. Some had political reasons to exaggerate. Some had financial reasons. Some likely believed more than the evidence justified because the age itself rewarded belief in marvels. The boundary between fraud and sincere error is not always clean. That uncertainty is part of what kept Manoa alive. A deliberate lie can collapse when exposed, but a layered misunderstanding, supported by ambition, bad translation, selective memory, and official-looking maps, is much harder to dismantle. Everyone can claim they inherited the story from someone else. No single failure destroys the whole structure. The city on the lake also shifted the center of the legend away from its indigenous roots. The Muisca ritual had been specific, local, sacred. Manoa was expansive and imperial. It belonged increasingly to European imagination, to books, maps, rivalry, investment, and the desire to find a counterweight to Spanish wealth. The farther El Dorado traveled from Guatavita, the more it became a European invention built over American landscapes. This does not mean indigenous people disappeared from the story. They remained central, but often in distorted roles, as guides, witnesses, informants, captives, or supposed guardians of hidden knowledge. Their words continued to feed the legend, but those words were filtered through European need. A complex world of local geography and politics was reduced again to the question, where is the Golden City? Manoa gave that question new life. It is worth noticing how different this version of El Dorado feels from the original ritual. The gilded ruler was about transformation and offering. Manoa was about possession and arrival. One belonged to ceremony, the other belonged to conquest. In the first, gold moved from human hands into sacred water. In the second, gold waited inside an imagined city for outsiders to claim it. That difference tells the whole story in miniature. By becoming Manoa, El Dorado completed one of its great migrations. It had moved from person to lake, from lake to kingdom, from kingdom to horizon, and now to a named city beside a vast inland water that many Europeans believed might still be found. It was no longer just a rumor told by men returning from hardship. It was a feature of the mental map of South America. And mental maps can be more stubborn than physical ones. A physical map can be corrected by survey, travel, and repeated observation. A mental map resists because it is drawn with hope. The city on Lake Paraim existed most powerfully in that inner geography, where desire made room for it long after the land refused to confirm it. Manoa kept the golden dream alive not by proving El Dorado, but by postponing its death. It gave believers a new place to look, a new name to speak, and a new lake to imagine shining somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary doubt. The city had still never been found. But once again, failure had not ended the legend. It had only taught it to move. Chapter 13. Sir Walter Raleigh and the English Dream of Gold. By the time Sir Walter Raleigh entered the story, El Dorado was no longer only a Spanish fever. It had become a European temptation. The legend had crossed borders more easily than armies could. It moved through reports, translations, rumors, captured documents, sailors' talk, courtly ambition, and the hungry imagination of rival empires. Spain had drawn enormous wealth from the Americas. That fact alone made every other European power restless. If one empire had found Mexico and Peru, why should another not find its own golden prize? For England, still reaching toward overseas power, El Dorado offered more than treasure. It offered a challenge to Spain. Raleigh understood this very well. He was not simply a dreamer wandering after a campfire story. He was a courtier, soldier, writer, investor, and political survivor. A man who knew that geography could become propaganda if described with enough force. In his hands, El Dorado was not only a place to be found, it was an argument. The argument went something like this. Spain had grown mighty from American wealth, but its control was not complete. Somewhere in Guyana, beyond the Spanish grasp, there might be a rich empire waiting. If England moved boldly, it could strike at Spain's prestige, gain treasure, open trade, claim territory, and prove that the future did not belong to Iberian power alone. That was the dream, and like many imperial dreams, it dressed ambition in the language of destiny. Raleigh's expedition to Guyana in the 1590s must be understood in that wider struggle. By then, the legend of Manoa, the city by the lake, had given El Dorado a new home in the European imagination. The supposed Lake Paraim and the Golden City near it were not just rumors drifting at the edge of maps. They had become part of a political fantasy, a hidden inland empire, rich enough to shift the balance of power. Raleigh went looking for it, but he also went looking for a story. That distinction matters. Exploration in this period was rarely only exploration. It was performance. A voyage had to be narrated, justified, sold to patrons, defended against rivals, and made meaningful to people who had not seen the rivers, forests, heat, hunger, or uncertainty. Raleigh's writings about Guyana did not merely report the search. They helped shape how others imagined it. He presented the region as rich, promising, strategically important, and open to English ambition. The evidence, however, remained thinner than the desire placed upon it. Raleigh gathered reports. He listened to indigenous accounts, Spanish claims, and local political information. Some details may have reflected real societies, real conflicts, real geography, and real resources, but the great city of Manoa did not appear. The Golden Empire remained beyond confirmation. As before, the legend survived by standing just outside the reach of direct proof. For Raleigh, that uncertainty was dangerous and useful at the same time. Useful because uncertainty allowed possibility. He could describe what might exist, what others had claimed, what Spain feared, what England could gain. He could turn partial information into national opportunity, but dangerous, because a promise made to power eventually demands return. Courts do not live on atmosphere. Investors do not applaud beautiful uncertainty forever. A hidden city is only politically valuable while people still believe it may soon become visible. Raleigh's El Dorado was therefore deeply personal. His fortunes rose and fell in the violent weather of Elizabethan and early Stuart politics. Favor at court could lift a man high. Suspicion could destroy him. For someone like Raleigh, a discovery in Guyana was not just a colonial project. It could be rescue, vindication, proof that his enemies had underestimated him, proof that his ambitions had been visions rather than vanity. This is why El Dorado so often attached itself to men in need of redemption. The legend promised not only gold in the earth, but a second life in history. A failed commander could become a founder. A disgraced courtier could become a prophet of empire. A nation anxious about its place in the world could imagine itself chosen for a prize others had missed. El Dorado was flexible enough to serve them all. But Raleigh's pursuit also shows how far the myth had traveled from its sacred beginning. The Muisca ritual at Lake Guatavita had been local, ceremonial, and rooted in a specific spiritual landscape. By Raleigh's time, that origin was almost buried beneath layers of imperial rivalry. El Dorado was now a weapon in a European contest. It could be used to attract support, embarrass Spain, inspire colonization, and justify intrusion into lands already inhabited by indigenous peoples with their own alliances and conflicts. The Golden City had become diplomatic language. It had become marketing. It had become strategy. And still, beneath all that, it remained a rumor. There is something almost tragic in Raleigh's relationship with the myth. He was intelligent enough to understand the value of doubt, and ambitious enough to lean against it. He could see that Guyana mattered even without a literal golden city. Its rivers, peoples, resources, and position against Spanish power were real. But El Dorado gave the project a brightness ordinary strategy could not match. It made geography glow. That glow was difficult to resist. For English readers, Raleigh's Guyana offered a different kind of conquest story from the Spanish model. It suggested that Spain had been brutal, greedy, and vulnerable, that indigenous peoples might prefer English alliance, that a great opportunity remained open. Some of this was political theater. Some of it reflected genuine rivalry. All of it served a purpose: to make English expansion appear not only profitable, but morally and historically justified. This is another way myths survive. They do not merely promise wealth. They make people feel righteous while seeking it. Raleigh's later return to the Guyana dream, under far more desperate circumstances, only deepened the legend's shadow. By then, El Dorado was no longer simply an opportunity. It was a wager against failure. The city that had never been found became tied to a man trying to recover what politics, imprisonment, and time had taken from him. The search for gold became entangled with the search for lost status. And when the promise failed again, the consequences were not confined to maps. Raleigh's dream of Guyana ended not in the discovery of Manoa, but in ruin. His final expedition brought conflict, disappointment, and political disaster. The Golden City could not save him. In that sense, he joined a long procession of men who believed El Dorado might turn personal ambition into destiny, only to discover that the myth consumed reputations as easily as bodies. Yet Raleigh's failure did not erase the legend. In some ways, it made it more famous. His writings helped carry El Dorado deeper into the English imagination. The city became part of a larger story about empire, rivalry, and the unknown interior of South America. It remained there not because it had been proven, but because it had been beautifully and usefully described. A myth with political value can survive disappointment for a very long time. Raleigh did not find El Dorado, but he helped internationalize it. He took a legend shaped by Spanish conquest and made it speak in English accents of national ambition, anti-Spanish rivalry, personal restoration, and the hope that somewhere beyond the river bends of Guyana, history might still be hiding a prize large enough to change everything. The city remained invisible. The desire around it did not. Chapter 14. The maps that kept the city alive. A rumor spoken aloud has a certain weakness. It depends on breath, memory, and the willingness of another person to believe it. It can be challenged in the moment. Who told you that? Where did they hear it? Did they see the place themselves? A rumor can shrink when it meets a careful listener. But put that rumor on a map, and something changes. Suddenly, it has borders. Suddenly, it has a name. Suddenly, it appears to belong to the same world as mountains, rivers, ports, and coastlines. This was one of the reasons El Dorado lived so long. It was not preserved only by desperate soldiers or ambitious courtiers. It was preserved by ink. European cartographers, chroniclers, publishers, and readers helped give the Golden City a second life, long after expedition had failed to find it. The myth entered books and maps, and there it acquired a different kind of authority, quieter than a sword, but in some ways more persistent. A map does not have to shout. It simply shows. And because it shows, people tend to trust it. To modern eyes, old maps can look beautiful and strange, filled with sea monsters, decorative ships, wind heads, elaborate lettering, and continents still taking shape. It is tempting to see their errors as charming, almost innocent. But for people living in the 16th and 17th centuries, maps were not merely art. They were instruments of power, commerce, planning, imagination, and claim. To draw a place was to make it discussable. To name it was to make it available for ambition. So when El Dorado, Manoa, or Lake Parim appeared in cartographic form, the legend gained weight. The city had not been found, but it had been located. That distinction is subtle and dangerous. A place can be located in the mind before it is confirmed on the ground. Once that happens, expeditions do not feel like wild guesses. They feel like attempts to reach something already half known. The map becomes a promise that someone else has done enough thinking to justify your risk. Of course, map makers were not all fools, and they were not all liars. Many worked with the best information available to them, which was often incomplete, second-hand, contradictory, or shaped by political needs. A cartographer in Europe might never see the rivers of Guyana or the flooded plains of the interior. He might rely on travelers' accounts, official reports, earlier maps, indigenous information filtered through interpreters, and the expectations of patrons. If a respected source mentioned a great inland lake, it could be copied. If another map included it, omission might seem like ignorance rather than caution. In this way, uncertainty reproduced itself. One speculative line became the parent of another. One doubtful lake appeared again, slightly adjusted, then again, with stronger lettering. One imagined city survived because no single mapmaker wanted to be the one who left out what others had included. There is an almost bureaucratic quality to the survival of the myth. It was not always kept alive by passion. Sometimes it was kept alive by copying, by professional caution, by the fear of leaving a blank space too blank, by the quiet habit of treating inherited information as more reliable than it was. This is how myths become respectable. They learn to look administrative. A soldier's boast may sound suspect. A courtier's promotional account may sound self-serving. But a map, engraved and circulated, offers a cleaner illusion. It removes the sweat, hunger, mistranslation, and violence that produced the original report. It strips away the uncertain voice and replaces it with place names. A messy chain of hearsay becomes a neat feature in the landscape. The viewer does not see the captive questioned under pressure. The viewer sees a lake. The viewer does not hear the interpreter struggling across languages. The viewer sees a city. The viewer does not see the expedition turning back in failure. The viewer sees a route still waiting to be completed. This is why the cartographic life of El Dorado matters so much. Maps did not merely reflect belief. They manufactured it. They gave later explorers a visual grammar for hope. They made the absence of proof appear temporary, almost technical. The city was there on paper. The problem was only to reach it correctly. And paper can be more forgiving than land. Land resists. Rivers flood. Mountains exhaust. Forests confuse. People deny what invaders want to hear. Fever interrupts theory. Hunger edits ambition. But paper permits arrangement. It allows distance to be compressed, difficulty to be softened, and uncertainty to be given elegant borders. On a map, El Dorado could exist without mud, without mosquitoes, without bodies, without the political complexity of indigenous worlds. It could exist as pure possibility. Chroniclers did similar work in words. They preserved accounts, compared rumors, repeated marvels, and sometimes expressed doubt while still keeping the story in circulation. A writer could say that reports were uncertain, then describe them in enough detail to excite curiosity. He could distance himself from belief while still lending the legend another page of life. The result was a strange balance, skepticism and fascination feeding each other. This is not hypocrisy, necessarily. It is one of the oldest habits of storytelling. We say, perhaps it is not true, and then we keep speaking. El Dorado benefited from that habit. It occupied a perfect middle ground between the known and the impossible, too ordinary, and it would not hold attention. Too impossible, and it would be dismissed. But a golden city somewhere in the still misunderstood interior of South America, supported by earlier discoveries of real American wealth and by uncertain reports of lakes, rulers, and goldwork. That was just plausible enough to endure. Maps also served empire by making desire look orderly. European powers were not only imagining distant places, they were competing over them. A named region could be claimed, negotiated, invaded, defended, or used in arguments about priority. Even doubtful geography had political value. If a place might contain wealth, then it mattered who appeared to know it, who claimed access to it, and who could persuade others that it was worth pursuing. In this sense, El Dorado was useful even unfound. Especially unfound. An unfound city could not disappoint investors with exact numbers. It could not be taxed, exhausted, or compared unfavorably to earlier conquests. It remained available to hope. On the page, it could always be richer than reality. It could always wait beyond the last confirmed river, safely protected from measurement. That is perhaps the most revealing thing about the maps that kept the city alive. They were not just mistakes in geography. They were records of appetite. They showed what Europeans wanted the continent to contain. They marked not only rivers and mountains, but expectations. A map is often treated as a picture of the world. But maps also reveal the minds that made them. In the case of El Dorado, those minds were crowded with conquest, rivalry, investment, rumor, and the memory of real treasures already taken. The Golden City survived in ink because it served too many needs to vanish quickly. It explained old failures. It promised future triumph. It turned blankness into opportunity. It made the unknown feel almost owned. Eventually, the land would correct the paper. Explorers would travel farther. Surveys would improve. Reports would become harder to reconcile with the old fantasies. Lake Paraim would fade from serious geography. Manoa would lose its place among the credible cities of the world. The map would begin, slowly, to withdraw its permission. But for generations, ink gave El Dorado a body it never possessed. The city stood because it was drawn. And while men could doubt a rumor, they found it much harder to doubt a line confidently placed on a map. Chapter 15. The People Beneath the Legend. For a long time, El Dorado was told as a story about the men who searched, the commanders, the rebels, the cartographers, the courtiers, the survivors who staggered back with broken bodies and unfinished claims. Their names filled reports and histories because they were the ones writing, authorizing, defending, and promoting the expeditions. They became the visible figures in a story that often treated the land as empty space and indigenous people as background. But the land was not empty, and the people were not background. Every route toward El Dorado passed through worlds that already had histories, borders, alliances, rivalries, sacred places, food systems, trade networks, and political memory. The Golden City was a European fantasy, but the suffering it produced was not imaginary. It fell on real communities whose names were often recorded poorly, if recorded at all. This is the part of the legend that adventure stories tend to blur. A group of armed Europeans did not move through the interior like a thought moving across a page. They needed food. They needed labor. They needed guides. They needed interpreters. They needed information. And when those things were not freely given, they were often taken. The search for El Dorado converted indigenous knowledge into a resource to be extracted, much like gold itself. A person who knew a trail became valuable. A village with stored maize became valuable. A prisoner who could name a river became valuable. A rival community willing to speak against its enemies became valuable. And value, in the world of conquest, was dangerous. The legend placed indigenous communities in an impossible position. If they denied knowledge of a golden kingdom, they risked being accused of lying. If they offered information, whether accurate, misunderstood, or deliberately protective, they might redirect violence toward others or invite further demands. If they tried to avoid the invaders, avoidance could be treated as guilt. If they cooperated, cooperation did not guarantee safety. El Dorado made suspicion portable. It traveled with every expedition. To the men searching, a community was rarely allowed to be simply itself. It became a clue. Its gold ornaments suggested a source elsewhere. Its trade goods suggested hidden roots. Its silences suggested conspiracy. Its rituals suggested treasure. Its political rivalries became opportunities for manipulation. The more Europeans failed to find the city, the more pressure they placed on the people who supposedly knew the way. This was not a side effect of the myth. It was one of its main engines. Without indigenous labor and knowledge, many expeditions would have collapsed even faster than they did. Yet that dependence did not produce respect. More often, it produced coercion. People were forced to carry loads through terrain that exhausted even armored soldiers. They were compelled to guide strangers into dangerous regions. They were exposed to hunger, punishment, disease, and the violence of men whose expectations had been sharpened by disappointment. The search also brought disruption in less visible forms. An expedition passing through could consume stored food meant for a community's future. It could draw local groups into conflicts not of their choosing. It could spread disease along routes of contact. It could destabilize leadership by rewarding some factions and punishing others. It could turn sacred sites into targets and objects of ceremony into loot. These consequences do not always appear in the old accounts with the weight they deserve. European chroniclers often noticed indigenous suffering only when it affected the success of the expedition, the behavior of commanders, or the moral reputation of conquest. The dead who mattered most in the narrative were frequently Spanish dead. The lost men were European lost men. The tragedy was framed as the failure to find gold, not the damage caused by looking for it. That framing is part of the inheritance of El Dorado. Even today, the legend can be told as though the central mystery is where the city was. But perhaps the deeper question is what the idea of the city allowed people to ignore. It allowed invaders to see whole societies as temporary obstacles between themselves and wealth. It allowed sacred meanings to be dismissed as superstition unless they hinted at treasure. It allowed rumor to justify intrusion again and again. And it allowed erasure. The Muisca, for example, were not merely the people behind a golden anecdote. They were a complex civilization with political organization, skilled craft traditions, agriculture, trade, and ritual life. Yet in the legend, they are often reduced to the ceremony that Europeans misunderstood. Their world becomes a prologue to someone else's obsession. The same pattern repeated across the wider search. Communities in the Llanos, in Venezuela, in Guyana, along rivers and forest routes, were folded into the myth as witnesses or obstacles. They were made to serve a story they did not create. Their landscapes were renamed in European imagination. Their knowledge was translated into directions. Their losses became the unseen cost of a city no one could prove existed. A myth can be violent not only because of what people do in its name, but because of what it makes them unable to see. El Dorado made Europeans see gold everywhere. That meant they often failed to see law, memory, kinship, sovereignty, grief, and spiritual meaning. They saw offerings and thought of deposits. They saw ornaments and thought of mines. They saw resistance and thought of concealment. They saw difference and thought of inferiority. The legend did not invent these attitudes, but it gave them a glittering focus. There were, of course, moments of exchange, alliance, negotiation, and adaptation. Indigenous peoples were not passive figures waiting to be acted upon. They made choices under pressure. They misled, resisted, redirected, bargained, fought, fled, and used European rivalries when possible. Some communities may have pointed invaders toward enemies. Some may have shaped the rumor deliberately as a survival tactic. The history is not simple, and it should not be flattened into a single image of victimhood. But power was uneven. Steel, horses, disease, royal claims, forced labor systems, and imperial hunger transformed local decisions into matters of survival. The people beneath the legend were navigating a catastrophe that often arrived speaking the language of inquiry. Where is the gold? Who has it? Who knows the way? Questions can be weapons when backed by violence. This is why the story of El Dorado must eventually turn away from the city that was never found and toward the people who were always there. The absence of the city has fascinated generations, but the presence of indigenous societies is the more important reality. They were not failed clues. They were not supporting characters in a European adventure. They were the human world through which the legend cut its path. To tell the story honestly, we have to let the Golden City shrink. We have to let the people become larger than the myth. Because El Dorado, for all its brightness, was an act of misdirection. It drew attention toward an imagined place while obscuring the lived places damaged by the search. It made men famous for looking, while countless others suffered for being looked through. The gold that Europeans wanted was never enough to satisfy them, but the human cost was already more than enough to condemn the dream. Chapter 16. The Death of the Golden City. El Dorado did not die all at once. There was no single expedition that reached the final valley, looked around, and proved to everyone that the city was not there. No dramatic unveiling. No moment when Europe collectively folded its maps, crossed out the name, and admitted that the dream had been too large for the evidence. Myths rarely end so cleanly. El Dorado faded under pressure. It faded because more rivers were traveled, more mountains crossed, more reports compared, more coastlines fixed, more interiors described. It faded because the world that had protected it, the world of uncertain maps, second-hand testimony, imperial rumor, and enormous blank spaces, slowly became harder to maintain. The city survived in ignorance, but exploration kept reducing the places where ignorance could hide. That does not mean knowledge arrived gently. The same processes that weakened belief in El Dorado often brought new forms of conquest, settlement, extraction, missionization, and control. The death of the Golden City was not the end of violence in South America. It was only the decline of one particularly powerful fantasy. The continent did not become safe because one myth lost credibility. It became better known to Europeans, and that was its own kind of danger. Still, the legend began to suffer from accumulated disappointment. Each failed expedition mattered. Not immediately, perhaps. One failure could be dismissed as bad luck. 2 could be blamed on poor leadership. 3 could be explained by wrong routes, lying guides, hostile terrain, or incomplete information. But over generations, failure gathered weight. The Golden City remained always reported, never reached, always promised, never measured, always described by someone just removed from direct verification. At a certain point, that pattern becomes evidence of its own. The supposed Lake Parim, long associated with Manoa, also began to lose its authority. As geographic knowledge of the Guyana region improved, the great inland lake shown or imagined by earlier Europeans became increasingly difficult to reconcile with observation. Lakes, wetlands, seasonal flooding, and misunderstood reports may have contributed to the belief, but the vast permanent body of water required by the legend did not emerge as expected. The shoreline that had once supported the city in imagination began to dissolve. Without the lake, Manoa lost its stage. Without Manoa, El Dorado lost one of its grandest late forms. But the collapse was gradual because the myth had never depended on one piece alone. It had survived the disappointment of Guatavita. It had survived the failure to locate a golden kingdom in the highlands. It had survived hunger in the Llanos, mutiny on the rivers, and the ruin of ambitious men. It had survived by changing shape. So even as serious belief weakened, the story lingered. There is an important difference between a belief dying and a story dying. A belief asks to be acted upon. A story asks to be repeated. El Dorado slowly passed from the first category into the second. It became less a practical objective for conquest and more a symbol, a cautionary tale, an emblem of impossible wealth, a name for desire itself. The city that once sent men into the interior became something people could invoke without expecting to find it. In that transformation, it lost danger of one kind and gained durability of another. This is why the death of El Dorado is not really an ending. It is a change of habitat. The legend moved from maps into literature, from royal plans into metaphor, from expeditionary obsession into cultural memory. People stopped needing the city to be real in order to use it. El Dorado could now mean any shining promise that retreats when approached, any fortune that ruins the seeker, any imagined abundance that makes the present world look insufficient. In that sense, the myth survived its own disproof. But for the men and communities caught in the age of searching, the fading came too late. Too many expeditions had already marched. Too many villages had already been forced to answer questions shaped by greed. Too many sacred meanings had been converted into treasure clues. Too many dead had been folded into the excuse that the next attempt might succeed. When belief finally weakened, it did not refund the cost. That is one of the bitter truths of historical myths. They can lose credibility long after they have done their damage. A false idea does not need to be permanent to be devastating. It only needs to be believed intensely by the right people, with the right weapons, at the right moment. El Dorado had been exactly that. It belonged to an age when European conquest was still improvising its way through the Americas, when real discoveries of wealth made exaggeration seem wise rather than foolish, when maps were hungry for names, and when ambition could disguise itself as exploration. As that age changed, the Golden City became harder to defend. More information entered the record. The blank spaces shrank. The old rumors began to look less like clues and more like echoes. Yet even then, some part of the story resisted ordinary correction. Because El Dorado was never only a geographical claim. It was emotional. It answered a longing that evidence alone could not easily silence. It told men that somewhere beyond hardship lay compensation, that suffering would be paid back, that the world still contained a hidden reserve of meaning and wealth, waiting for those bold enough to reach it. Who wants to give up a story like that? Especially after lives have been spent in its name. The Golden City died because the land refused, patiently and repeatedly, to become the fantasy drawn over it. It died because no expedition could produce streets of gold. No map could keep inventing lakes forever. and no rumor could remain persuasive once too many people had returned empty-handed. It died under the slow discipline of accumulated reality. But it did not vanish. It left behind a shape in the imagination, the unreachable city, the fatal promise, the shining error. Its death as geography became its birth as metaphor, and perhaps that is why El Dorado still feels alive, even after the maps have changed and the expeditions have ended. We no longer search for it with horses, steel, and royal licenses. But the human habit that made it possible has not disappeared. We still know how to mistake desire for evidence. We still know how to follow a horizon because it glitters. Chapter 17. What El Dorado really was. By the time the Golden City began to fade from serious maps, the old question had become almost misleading. Where was El Dorado? It sounds simple. It invites a simple answer. A lake in Colombia, a lost city in Guyana, a rumor in the Andes, a mistake on a map, a dream in the minds of men who wanted too much. But El Dorado was never only one of those things. That is why it survived for so long. If it had been merely a city, it could have been found or not found. If it had been merely a lie, it could have been exposed. If it had been merely a ritual, it might have remained within the history of the Muisca and never expanded into one of the most famous legends in the world. El Dorado endured because it was a chain, each link made from something different, and not all of it false. At the beginning was a real world. The Muisca highlands were real. Lake Guatavita was real. Gold work was real. Offerings were real, or at least strongly rooted in accounts that point toward genuine ritual practice. A ruler associated with gold dust may well have stood at the center of the earliest form of the story. Though the details we have are filtered through later colonial voices, that matters, because it prevents us from dismissing El Dorado as pure invention. The legend began with contact between reality and appetite. Then came misunderstanding. Europeans entered indigenous worlds with limited language, limited patience, and enormous expectations. They did not arrive as neutral listeners. They arrived after Mexico, and Peru had taught them that American wealth could be transformed into European power. So when they heard of gold, they did not ask only what it meant. They asked where it came from, how much there was, and who controlled it. Those questions shaped the answers before they were even spoken. A sacred offering became a deposit. A ceremonial figure became a golden ruler. A golden ruler became a kingdom. A kingdom became a city. A city became a moving target, always farther inland, always waiting beyond the failure of the latest expedition. This is the central truth of El Dorado. It was not a single falsehood, but an expanding misinterpretation. It was built from real ceremonies, real objects, real geographies, real societies, and real violence. But each time those realities passed through the machinery of conquest, they were changed. Meaning became evidence. Evidence became rumor. Rumor became geography. Geography became policy. Policy became suffering. And because each stage contained a trace of the stage before it, the whole structure seemed stronger than it was. This is why the myth could not be easily killed by disappointment. A failed search for a golden city did not disprove the existence of Muisca gold. A limited recovery from Lake Guatavita did not prove Manoa. A real indigenous account of wealth in one direction did not confirm an empire of treasure beyond the rivers. But in the minds of believers, these distinctions blurred. They treated every fragment as part of the same hidden pattern. El Dorado was the pattern they wanted to see. It was also a projection. Europeans imagined in the Americas a solution to European hungers: debt, ambition, rivalry, social frustration, imperial competition, religious mission, and personal failure. The Golden City became a screen on which men could cast their hopes. For one man, it meant fortune. For another, office. For another, redemption. For a crown, territory. For an investor, return. For a writer, marvel. For a cartographer, a named shape in the unknown. A myth that can serve that many purposes does not need strong evidence. It only needs usefulness, and El Dorado was extraordinarily useful. It justified expeditions into lands Europeans barely understood. It gave commanders a reason to demand men, supplies, and authority. It allowed failure to be postponed by shifting the destination. It made violence look like the price of discovery. It turned indigenous communities into instruments of a European search, even when those communities had no golden city to reveal. In that sense, El Dorado was not hidden in the jungle. It was hidden in the assumptions of the people looking for it. They believed wealth existed to be possessed. They believed sacred objects were incomplete until converted into treasure. They believed distance protected marvels. They believed indigenous testimony mattered most when it confirmed European desire. They believed that hardship purified ambition rather than warning against it. Those beliefs created the city more powerfully than stone ever could. The real El Dorado, then, was not a place waiting to be uncovered. It was a process by which ritual became rumor, rumor became map, map became expedition, and expedition became catastrophe. It was a way of misreading the world while claiming to discover it. That does not make the story less haunting. It makes it more so. Because a lost city can be mourned as a mystery, a misunderstanding can be studied as a mistake. But El Dorado was also a warning about what happens when power listens only for what it wants to hear. The tragedy was not simply that Europeans failed to find a city of gold. The tragedy was that they encountered real worlds and reduced them to clues. The Muisca did not need to be the doorway to a greater secret in order to matter. Lake Guatavita did not need to contain endless treasure in order to be sacred. Indigenous societies across the northern half of South America did not need to confirm a European fantasy in order to possess history, dignity, and meaning. El Dorado was never the truth of those worlds. It was the shadow cast over them by conquest, and yet, the myth still grips us because it exposes something persistent in human nature. We are drawn to stories that promise a hidden answer large enough to redeem our losses. We want to believe that beyond the next difficulty, there is compensation, that suffering will be balanced. That desire, if pursued with enough force, will eventually become proof. El Dorado says, "Be careful. Not every shining promise is a destination. Some are mirrors. Some reveal less about the world ahead than about the hunger behind the eyes that search." So what was El Dorado really? It was a gilded ruler remembered through conquest. It was a sacred lake turned into a treasure pit. It was a map-maker's confidence placed over uncertainty. It was an empire's appetite dressed as exploration. It was real gold made to carry impossible meaning. And above all, it was the story of men who kept mistaking the glitter of their own ambition for a light on the horizon. Chapter 18. The gold that was never enough. In the end, the city was never found because the city was never really there. Not as the conquerors imagined it. No streets paved with gold, no shining walls beside a hidden lake, no kingdom waiting in silence for Europeans to arrive and make history out of it. The thing that drew men across rivers, mountains, jungles, and plains was not a city, but a promise. And promises can be more dangerous than places, because they do not need to exist in order to command belief. El Dorado began with something real: gold dust, sacred water, offerings, ritual authority. A society whose meanings outsiders only partly understood. That should have been enough. A real ceremony beside Lake Guatavita was already extraordinary. The Muisca world was already complex, rich in its own forms of order and value. But conquest is rarely satisfied by enough. It asks the next question, and then the next, until meaning collapses into appetite. Where is the rest? That question haunted the legend from the beginning. A few gold objects were not enough. A sacred lake was not enough. A highland civilization was not enough. A rumor of wealth became proof of greater wealth. A failed expedition became evidence that the true route lay elsewhere. Men died, and because they died, others believed the prize must be worthy of the cost. The dream grew larger to justify the graves behind it. This is what makes El Dorado one of history's most haunting myths. It is not merely a story about greed, though greed runs through it like a fever. It is a story about how human beings can become trapped by the need for their desire to be meaningful. The longer the search continued, the harder it became to admit that the Golden City might be nothing more than a misunderstanding dressed in armor. Thousands were pulled into that misunderstanding. Some vanished in forests, some drowned in rivers, some starved on plains that seemed to offer another horizon forever. Indigenous communities paid an even deeper price, often without having chosen any part in the dream. Their lands were crossed, their food taken, their knowledge coerced, their sacred places reduced to clues in someone else's fantasy. The gold was real. That is the uncomfortable part. If there had been no gold at all, perhaps the story would have burned out sooner. But there was just enough truth to keep the lie alive, just enough glitter to confuse evidence with destiny, just enough treasure beneath the surface to make men believe the whole world was hiding more. And perhaps that is why El Dorado has never fully left us. We may no longer draw Manoa on maps or send armored columns toward Lake Parime, but the shape of the legend remains familiar. The perfect fortune just ahead, the hidden answer that will redeem every sacrifice, the belief that one more risk, one more journey, one more act of destruction will finally reveal the thing that makes it all worthwhile. El Dorado warns us that the most dangerous dreams are not always false from beginning to end. Sometimes they begin in truth, borrow its authority, and then grow beyond anything truth can support. The city that was never found still stands, in a way. Not in Colombia, not in Guyana, not beside a vanished lake, but in the human imagination, where gold is never only gold, and enough is never quite enough.